Hello, my name's David Runciman, and this is Past, Present, Future, the History of Ideas podcast. This week we're doing something a little bit different. In place of our 2 regular episodes, we have 3 slightly shorter episodes, all of them a conversation with the theatre director and writer Dominic Dromgoole, who was longtime artistic director of Shakespeare's Globe. And we're talking about 3 events in the art world, revolutionary events that happened in Paris. We'll be coming on to the Rites of Spring in 1913, which nearly caused a riot, to Ubu Roi from 1896, which also nearly caused a riot. But today, we're talking about the opening of the Salon des Refusés in May 1863, which, if it didn't cause a riot, did change art forever. We recorded this conversation with Dominic when he was in New York. He was opening a play there, and he's speaking to us from a hotel room. So apologies if the sound on his side is a little bit tinier than normal. Do stick with it. We're going to be talking about 2 paintings in particular, as well as setting the context for the event itself. One is from the official Salon. It's Cabanel's The Birth of Venus. The other from the Salon des Refusés, Manet's Déjeuner sur l'herbe. You might want to look them up as we go along. They're both readily available online, and then you'll be able to see what we're talking about. Dominic, the event that we're talking about today, it happened, the opening of the Salon des Refusés, on the 15th of May, 1863. So we're talking about 15 years after the 1848 revolution, almost exactly 15 years after the June days in Paris, when Paris was a bloodbath. But 15 years is a long time. Can we set the scene for it at all? I mean, what's your sense of what kind of a city Paris was in 1863? What was the vibe, would you say?
I think it was one of enormous tension and unbelievable contrasts and a great pull to the past and at the same time a great surge to the future. And the 2 things in a sort of fairly thinning and attenuating state of tension with each other. You had a state of politics that was almost medieval in its control and authority and control of the press and control of all of the mechanisms of government under Napoleon III, who had sort of legitimately come to power in 1848 and who then sort of seized control of the state in a coup d'etat practically in 1851 and had shut down all of the forms of participatory government that had been there before. And so you had France sort of plunged backwards. At the same time, you had this enormous technological advance and a sense that France and Paris were setting a pace that the rest of the world would have to run to catch up with in terms of crisscrossing train networks across the whole country, in terms of communications, in terms of public transport, in terms of refinement of its banking system, in terms of sorting out a sort of modern form of agriculture which got rid of the famines of the past. There was a real forward momentum. And between the 2, there was this chasm, and in that chasm there was a lot of rage and anger and opportunity for art and for people to try and express that difficulty. I think Paris as well was something quite extraordinary. I think the beautiful boulevards and grid system and sort of imagining a city as a whole work of art, that sense you get when you're in Paris that you never get in London and you never get in British cities, that someone had flown up in a balloon and looked down and done a lattice work map and said, this is how we want our city to be. A lot of that comes around the time of Napoleon III and Haussmann and these extraordinary wide, beautiful boulevards. And so there was a sense that the whole city was a grand and brilliant work of art. And that gave an enormous amount of pleasure and excitement and pride. Although also I think everybody was always questioning its provenance and how it was a not modern, not democratic form of government that was allowing it to happen.
When I was reading about the Salon des Refusés, the thing that astonished me, I had no idea, was that the sponsor of it was Napoleon III. So the emperor was the person who gave his blessing to this event that in my mind I'd always thought of as this kind of countercultural thing. You know, the rejects, the refuseniks, the people who hadn't got into the main salon. And here was their alternative venue. But it was his idea. And Napoleon III, he embodies this tension because he's an emperor. He's harking back to his uncle, but also, as you say, this is a very old form of government. And yet he thought of himself as a very modern man, a very up-to-date person, the person who was taking France into the future. What did he think he was doing in sponsoring this salon? Was it a kind of man of the people act, do you think? Or alternatively, you know, the other way, I think some people read it at the time, which is if it failed, it would be a way of reinforcing the status of the official salon, the official way of doing things. I've read about it, but I can't tell what Napoleon thought he was doing.
I think he was very canny, and he was very politically astute, and he was worried always about dissent and worried about popular disapproval. And who wouldn't be, given the history of France over the last 70 or 80 years? It would incline someone to listen to the streets and be careful about what was going on.
It's true that autocrats are notoriously touchy about public opinion. Sometimes people think, you know, to be an autocrat is to be above all that. Actually, to be an autocrat is to be more paranoid than a democrat because you don't know what people are thinking because there are no elections.
Exactly true. And he was always listening. They just had a very disastrous expedition to Mexico and fought a very unsuccessful war there. And although the sort of French Empire did extend significantly during his time, that was a big disaster and a big own goal. And he could feel a bubble of dissent coming up from that. He could obviously sense that in the intellectual corners of Paris and in the bohemian corners of Paris, he was never completely going to be flavour of the month. He had a wife, Eugenie, who was extravagant beyond compare, beyond even the imagination of Marie Antoinette, and who was never going to be thought of as salt of the earth. All of those things were sort of floating around in his head. And when the Salon, which was this yearly display of supposedly the best art of the country, which had been going on since 1667, 17th century, outdid itself in its ability to reject and refuse more work than it ever had before. It was always a source of contention and it was always a source of upset, the amount of work that it pushed back. But in this particular year, 1863, it really outdid itself. There were two astonishingly blue-blooded, aristocratic named, multiply titled directors who happily pushed back almost 2/3 of the work that had been submitted. And this caused a scandal, and it caused a scandal in the tight coterie of artists and their studios and the places they hung out. But the scandal spread wider. And Napoleon, as you say, I mean, was sensitive to the noise from the streets, and he obviously heard it. And he went to look round the work that had been rejected, thought about what to do, and thought that the best mechanism to diffuse this dissent was to have a salon for the rejected, the Salon de Refusés, and to plump them all together in one place. And as he said, to let the public decide on whether they were worthy of attention or not. And to be honest, it was quite a brilliant maneuver because rather than just continuing this rage and dissatisfaction, he managed to corral all of the grumpiness into a single place. And he managed to say back to the public, it's up to you. It was a clever mechanism. The other thing to say quickly about Napoleon III is he was an amazing believer in distracting the public with noise and spectacle and fireworks and big public events. On the bread and circuses side, he was a big believer in circuses. And it was something that the British were very snooty about and said, oh, well, the French will always put up with political slavery if you give them something entertaining to distract them. But Napoleon sort of made it work. And so it was part of his ongoing noisy party of distraction.
And in a way, it was part of his fake democracy because Napoleon III was a kind of fake democrat. He believed in the voice of the people. He believed in listening to the voice of the people, just not in such a way that they could get rid of him.
He did some extraordinary things. Like he enshrined the right to strike, which you wouldn't expect of an autocrat. He, under the encouragement of his wife, he allowed women to go into universities and to extend that side of the franchise. So there were elements of what he was doing which were sort of surprisingly democratic and surprisingly open.
But this one, it feels a bit like it's that version of democracy, which is the spectacle version rather than the substance, in the sense he wasn't saying, let's have a jury of the people to compete with the jury of the official salon. Let's ask ordinary people who they think should be in this show. It was kind of, let's throw it open to the public. Let's make a big spectacle of the whole thing. Let's make it an event and see if people show up. I mean, it's that kind of democracy, which is a form of democracy. Will the people show up?
Yes, and what he said was, let's have everything. It is democratic. It's a very canny way of sort of diluting opposition into just confusion, because you're just presenting so much and such a blend of bad art, good art, crazy art, wild art, modern art, ancient art, that the audience just goes, oh, they just put their hands up in despair and say, I can't deal with all of this. So the proposition was that everything that had been rejected from the traditional salon, everything could go in. Initially, those who were rejected, who did largely form around a coterie that were the people who then went on to become what we call the Impressionists, who all hung out together in the Café Bard, who all flaneured enthusiastically together all across Paris all day long, charging around in long coats and top hats and arguing about art and philosophy and the streets and the people. There was that sort of hardcore coterie at the heart of the opposition, and they were part of the rejected, but there was a huge number of other people as well. And so when Napoleon said, we're having everyone, initially that group said, whoop-de-doo, this is great, we can show it to the traditional artists and we can show them how we're much more superior. And then after the invitation, the numbers of people who were going to go into the Salon des Refusés slowly diminished and honed down, because discreetly through the press, Napoleon and the academicians started to disrespect the Salon des Refusés before it opened, calling it the Salon of the Vanquished and the Salon of the Losers and the Salon of the rubbishy artists. And so then the numbers sort of whittled down.
Because it wasn't called, which it could have been, the Salon of the People. I mean, it's a very distinctive way of labeling it. This is a sort of great democratic event, but we're going to call these people the refused.
Yes, and I mean, and this sort of thing is, as you know, it is complex. I mean, the people probably would have preferred the art of the salon. I mean, in the way that the people prefer, I don't want to make the wrong sort of judgment call, but, they love the work of Jacques Vetriano, and, the Academy doesn't like the work of Jacques Vetriano. So exactly what the people want at any given moment is not necessarily what posterity would record as the great art of that period. And that's an important thing to say about the salon, the traditional salon, is that it wasn't hoity-toity and aristocratic and distant from the people. It was cheap as chips. It only cost a franc to go in. And over the course of the several weeks that it was open in this vast hall, people estimate that almost 15% of the whole of Paris managed to visit it. That's the traditional salon. So that was a big populist art show on a scale that we can't really imagine. And when you think of the Sensation exhibition of 97 and the sort of crowds that had, but you'd have to maximize that by 10 or 20 to understand the scale of the number of people who went through the traditional salon.
In a way, it's more like the Great Exhibition of 1851, which some astonishing proportion of the British population went to this official celebration of Britishness and the world and the empire and all that. It wasn't a countercultural event, the Great Exhibition, but everybody went.
And the salon was yearly. And it was yearly and it was about art. So the revolution that was within the Salon des Refusés and within the people it were presenting, it was about a form of art and it was about how to make art and what art should be about. But you'd be in questionable territory if you said it was an inherently democratic group of people making a political protest.
So the artists who did stick with the label of the refused included, as you say, people who were going to go on to be associated with the Impressionists. And one person in particular who I think became a kind of leader of the artists who appeared in the Salon des Refusés, Edouard Manet. Tell us a bit about his role in this, because he was rejected. He had been rejected by the official Salon, but he embraced this opportunity. In some ways, he made it his own.
He did. He was sort of a contrary figure, Manet, in a rather wonderful way, is that he was always desperate for the approval of the Academy and the Salon, at the same time as loathing and detesting them and feeling completely contrary to the art they made and the art they championed. And everything about him, when he got a brush in his hand, was the opposite of what the Academy wanted. The Academy, just to paint a picture, the art they approved of was unbelievably skillfully technically achieved, hugely well burnished, no evidence of the painter's hand, brilliant sort of photographic realism, either in miniature, in portraits, or on large scale in landscapes with pictures of Napoleon retreating, and with a competitive sense around very refined technical achievements, like who could best capture the flight of a horse as it moved across a battlefield or in a race. And, that was what you were given marks for and what you thought great for. But the intention was that the artist wouldn't be there, wouldn't be present, that you just dissolve into the picture and disappear into that world. Manet was the opposite. When he had a brush in his hand, he was all about the presence of the artist. He was all about seeing the process of making. He daubed paint on thickly and leaving behind a sort of signature in almost every stroke. He didn't paint for perspective. He painted often quite two-dimensionally, quite influenced by the Japanese art that was coming through and quite influenced by his love of sort of Spanish irreal art. And so you feel everything pushed out at you with incredible energy, almost like it's sort of bursting out of the frame. He didn't do what the academicians did, which is do an unbelievably carefully delineated drawing and then fill in that with, minute invisible brushstrokes. He started with colour and he sort of splashed colour around. And whereas the academicians did a base of a sort of gravy brown that your eye could disappear into, he did his base in a rather bold white, so that all throughout the painting there's energy and vibrancy and life, and you constantly feel that his paintings are sort of shouting at you, saying hello, and shouting at you in a rather bawdy, wild vernacular.
And he left paintings unfinished, crucially, didn't he?
And he loved leaving paintings unfinished, which is, I think, one of the things I adore most about him. There's a great painting called In the Certain Tuileries, an early painting with all of these fantastic flaneury figures in their top hats. There's more top hats in the picture than in any other work of art. And it's full of fascinating detail and excitement. And in the middle of it, there's just this great big splodge where he just sort of left it as a sort of quite aggressive, punkish way, just saying, don't fancy finishing that. Finish it yourself. And that's very true to the eye. When we go into a space full of people, we look around and you catch a detail. You see a chair in a corner, you see a lamp, you see an ice bucket, your eye moves around, but you don't capture the whole of the room all at the same time. Objects sort of glare at you and push at you, and some don't. And that was his determination, was to try and capture how perception is something that's dynamic and lively and always in its own way incomplete. So he wasn't trying to freeze time into stasis. He was trying to present its process and its unpredictability and its liveliness. However, all that said, bizarrely, as I said, at the beginning, he was desperate for the approval of the Academy. So he would paint these pictures year after year after year before the Salon de Refusés, and indeed after. And he knew they were the absolute opposite of what they wanted, but he'd trundle along with them in a wheelbarrow or carry them on his back and hand them in, and they'd get pushed back in his face. And he'd sort of scream and cry and rage and be tormented by the injustice of it all, and then pick up his brush and do another painting that would upset them all, which I rather admire. I just sort of understand the contrariness of it, but I quite admire it.
And did he see the Salon des Refusés as his opportunity? So the picture, I think, which is the one that is best remembered from the Salon des Refusés, is Manet's, it came to be known as Déjeuner sur l'herbe, which is not an incomplete picture, I don't think. It's pretty complete. But it is, I mean, it is shocking. I think it is still shocking. I don't know what you think, but I still think, I mean, it's a really bracing work of art in lots of ways, both stylistically and also in terms of the content. But I think it was the centerpiece of the main room of the Salon des Refusés. Did he see this was his moment?
I think he probably knew that it was a sort of bomb about to go off, but he probably didn't realize the scale of it. It was originally entitled Le Bain, B-A-I-N, and then it was actually the crowd that rechristened it at Déjeuner sur l'Herbe as a sort of derogatory, ridiculing statement, although it pretty well defines it. I think he knew what he was doing because the Salon traditional that year was celebrated above all else for its nudes. There were nudes everywhere. Nudes. Flesh, male flesh, but mainly female flesh, presented in all forms and all sizes and all shapes, but actually in quite a titillating, sort of semi-pornographic way above all. And the centerpiece of the traditional salon was a painting by Cabanel called The Birth of Venus, which is fantastic, gloriously erotic sort of vision of seraphim and cherubim floating in the sea above Venus, who's lying on the sea and on her golden tresses with a very dirty sort of come hither look. And that was the sort of great glory of the traditional salon. Napoleon III bought it for 15,000 francs and it became the centerpiece of the whole thing. And this was in a Paris, which at the time, coming back to the theme of looking forward and looking backwards and what was allowed and what wasn't, women weren't allowed to go upstairs on a bus or an omnibus or a tram because there was a danger that people might see their naked ankle as they went up the steps below their long skirts. So there was this ridiculous double standard about what you were allowed to do in public and then what you would put on display in glorious abandon in the salon. So when Manet came to paint Déjeuner sur l'Herbe, he was painting a nude, and it was one of his first nudes. He sort of made a conscious decision to take on the nude, but he wasn't going to do it in the pornographic, titillating, come hither, objectivized way that it was done by Cabanel or largely by the Salon. He had a amazingly cool, brilliant, extraordinary relationship with this one woman, Victorine Mioron, who went on to become a great painter herself, who was his model and who brought a lot of her own sensibility, her own dispassionate, rather dead-eyed, disaffiliate, cool gaze to Manet's work and transformed it into something much more mature and much more interesting than it would have been without her. So they'd had a relationship over a number of paintings, and he determined that she would be the nude. And she was never going to bring a sort of sexy come hither look. She was always going to do something more challenging and more direct and bolder. And indeed she does. And her body's presented in colours that aren't prettified, the sort of natural pallor to her skin, an occasional bit of dirt. Her body's sort of hunched over in a way that's not remotely deliberately erotic. And she looks out. She had this amazing way of looking out of a painting, more than almost any model that I can think of. She stares right out at you. And she sort of says, yeah, I'm naked, so what? Who cares? Why is that important? Why are you getting so excited about it? I'm naked. And it's very confrontational and very powerful and has quite the effect. So there's her, and she brought her own sensibility, but the biggest thing is that Manet put a naked woman with contemporary realism. So the two men, I think Manet's brother and Manet's brother-in-law, in the same picture are in flaneur gear. They're in frock coats, the top hats are on one side, waistcoats, modern men in a modern world, in a modern park. And that was the great crime. That was the great scandal, is that it wasn't naked women in ancient Rome or naked women in ancient Greece or in a big biblical picture. It was a naked woman in contemporary Paris. And there are little winks in the picture. There's a frog in it hopping around, which is a bit of innuendo about prostitution. And that sort of scandalized and could upset people. But actually it was the juxtaposition of a naked lady with men who were completely modern in a bit of composition and framing that was drawn from the history of art and very astute references to the history of art. And that was just all too much in terms of collision.
And in some ways, it's still quite a lot. So when I look at it now, the clothes the men are wearing, partly where they're sitting, these are city outfits. These are urban looking guys. With this naked woman, it's not explained why she's naked and why they're clothed. It's not a naked woman and clothed men. It's something to do with the kinds of clothes they're wearing in that setting, in this sort of wooded, gladed setting, that is still, I don't know if shocking is the word, but it's still really bracing.
Yeah, bracing is very good, actually. Yeah, it still wakes you up. They're very cool people. They're not eager to please. They're not ingratiating. They have their own pride. They have a sort of, I dread the word hipster and I dread hipsters, but they have that sort of aura around them. They're doing something quite naughty. One of them is he's got his hand out, shaped in a way that can only be described as naughty, given its general direction, which is between the woman's legs. And all three are not looking at each other. Victorine is looking straight out at us in her extraordinary confrontational way. The guy in the middle, who's got a big moonlight Goya face, is staring slightly off to the left. The other guy, who's reclining more than either of the other two, is looking sort of straight back across between the other two. So none of them are looking at each other. There's nothing sort of warm or domestic or kind about their way of behaving with each other, which again is bracing and again makes you slightly uneasy. And then at the back, in a rather wonderful sort of subversive gesture, there's a typical romantic depiction of a woman bathing herself in a little sort of pond, which is a sort of wink to more romantic painting. And it is a way of Manet saying, well, look, I could have painted it like this. I could have painted that. I know how to do that, but I'm not. I'm doing something really, really different.
This painting it's not just with hindsight. I think even on the day the exhibition opened, which was 15th of May, 1863, this was the standout. But in a sea of art, as you say, of all kinds, some good, some bad, some extraordinary. The opening was itself an event, and it's become somewhat notorious, I think, in the history of art. Can you describe it? What was the event itself like? The people came in large numbers again, on a hot day. I think it was a hot day, packed, hot, sweaty, boiling, sweaty, and the people of Paris are there looking at the art that's been refused by the Academy. Can you capture what the day was like?
Well, the great luck of all of these artists and of us was that part of their gang was Zola. And Zola was part of the circle of people who drank together in the Café Bard. He was one of the flaneurs who walked the streets. He sort of listened to them, and he very fully and richly described them and made them come to life in his amazing book, wonderful, brilliant book, The Masterpiece. I mean, any Zola is worth looking at, but The Masterpiece is really quite breathtaking. And so he knew Manet, he knew the whole team, and he was there on that day, and he's given the most incredibly rich description of it. So you feel like you're there when you read it. It was an unbelievably hot day. It was packed. There was a queue for miles. I don't know what they estimated the audience would be. It was a much smaller building, the Palais de l'Industrie. Apologies for my pronunciation. A much smaller building than the traditional Salon. And eventually about 7,000 people turned up. There was a great long queue, people hawking catalogues outside. It was boiling within the building. There were birds flying around within and sort of hanging around up in the rafters. And all the way towards it, there was just this sense of excitement. There was just this noise. There was just this slight hysteria of a crowd that were expecting something extraordinary. And by and large, to be honest, they were coming to mock. I mean, they were coming to attack. And the energy very, very quickly turned into an energy of ridicule and lampooning and big, noisy, laughing, screaming, cruelty. And the centerpiece of it was at the final room that you came to. You walked through gallery after gallery after gallery, you came to the final room, and in the center of the final room was Déjeuner sur l'herbe. So it was deliberately placed there to cause maximum shock and maximum effect. And it succeeded. And Zola writes about how as people progressed through the gallery, this noise of sort of wheezing laughter and hysteria sort of got louder and louder as you got through to the last room. And in the last room, packed. I mean, so packed that, it's hard to sort of breathe almost. It always feels like a sort of George Grosz cartoon with tightly bound in men, sort of bulging and laughing and red faced and monocles dropping off. And everybody was trying to find any way they could of ridiculing this painting and saying, because of the broadness of the brushstrokes, one person said, oh, it must have been painted with a mop, and another man sort of almost attacked it with his cane. And so there was this sort of consistent, excessive, performative outrage, which in some way only helped. I mean, God knows it must have been awful to be Manet, or it must have been awful to be the model Victorine Mural, and to see all of this sort of abuse pouring down. But they must also have known, somewhere in their bones, you feel that the thing that's that sort of aggressively, assertively ridiculed must have something in it that is making people want to stamp on it and want to kill it. And that is a perverse form of approval, but it's a very powerful form of approval. I wrote a book in which this is part of one of the stories, one of the many stories. And it's often the case, you think of punk rock and the way people try to sort of stamp on that, or the play by a friend of mine, Blasted, by Sarah Kane. When you get this huffing, puffing, noisy, angry rage of disapproval, it's often because something's being said that people don't want to be heard and don't want to be part of discourse. And that in itself creates a value and an aura around a piece of work.
And was that rage and fury amplified by the critics? I mean, I guess it was, in the sense that the people and the critics were equally shocked.
The critics were equally shocked, but there were two forms of critics. I mean, there were the critics who allied to the Academy who were only ever going to say that it was inept and it didn't follow classical rules and that this was the artist being far too present and egotistic. And then there were the critics who were sort of more sided with that school of artists, who were more sympathetic. Nobody really said, this is amazing. I mean, any approval that there was sort of grudging and minor. But there were sort of noises, there were muted noises that this was the future and that the future had to be accounted for. And also, I think, most importantly, there was a sort of, before people started screaming and shouting and being abusive, there was a sort of silence. There's an English critic or cultural commentator at the time who recorded how people stopped as if they'd been lightly smacked or they'd walked into a wall or something. They were sort of like, oh. And then the way they coped with their shock was a sort of, oh, I don't like this. But in that brief gap between the shock of seeing them and then the disapproval, something was happening which other art wasn't doing. And this is what Impressionism is. Sorry, I mean, I think I spent 30, 40, 50 years of my life thinking Impressionism meant an impression of something, as in it's almost something, but it's not quite something. That's not what the initial meaning was. The initial meaning was that it leaves an impression on you. It has an effect. It leaves a sort of stamp of some sort on you.
Presumably part of the public reaction was simply because you couldn't behave like that in the official Salon. I mean, they may have wanted to, they may have not wanted to, but I'm guessing that the official Salon was a more decorous sort of venue. And here was an outlet where they'd almost been given permission by the title of the exhibition to vent. And yet it's clear that venting, whatever Napoleon, whatever the Academy thought would be achieved by this, it was scary for them too. And this wasn't the end of the Salon des Refusés, because there was another one the following year. But it feels like the next year there was a concerted effort not to repeat this, because many more of the artists who had exhibited in the original Salon des Refusés were accepted into the official Academy in 1864. And I think there was more of a concerted effort in 1864 to shove the other show full of bad art, in the sense of trying to reassert the difference between the two. It feels like something really spooked people about this response. So you might think, oh, it was a success. The public came out, they mocked, they jeered, they catcalled. Good old us in the Academy, we're still sort of broadly on the people's side. But that can't have been how they saw it. That something really frightened them, I think.
There was a lot to be frightened of. You know, if you got through the French Revolution and if you got through 1848 and you were aware of what was going on in the rest of Europe, you would feel like you were on thin ice all the time. And you'd be, worried by any form of dissent, even expressed in a painting. Broadly speaking, I'm not sure about this, but the British have always had this amazing way of assimilating opposition and the avant-garde and the difficult and the thorny and the strange. and bringing it into discourse and bringing it into more popular forms of discussion. I mean, it's a very quick journey. You present something that everybody goes is, oh my God, it's extraordinary, it's terrifying, it's ugly, it's repulsive. And then 5 years later, you're given an OBE and you're presented right in the center of the culture. And the British have always been really, really, really canny about that, in a way that my estimation, my guess is that the French are less accomplished at that. Because with Manet and with these various other artists, you would have thought that people would be spooked by it, and then they'd go, oh, let's bring them in the fold. We'll hang them with everyone else, but we'll put them in a room that's sort of a long way away from the centre, and we'll just quietly dissipate their effect, and then we'll give them an honour, and they'll shut up. And it wasn't like that. They kept pushing back against Manet. I mean, he did present a wonderful follow-up to Déjeuner sur Olympia the year after, another nude with the same model, Victorine mural, in the Salon. But then they kept rejecting Manet and saying, no, go away again. And the other artists, they kept saying, all right, you're going to come in this year. No, we don't want you, we don't want you, we don't want you. And so they kept sort of reviling them, and there was a real resistance to incorporating them. So yes, I do think they were spooked, but the way in which they reacted to that spookedness was, it didn't make it go away. It only in some ways increased the value of this oppositional confrontational art. It didn't actually become Impressionism until about 10 years later, when really the thing that made the difference, as is almost always the case, is money. Is that suddenly Americans were coming over, as they were for a long time before and since, but they were looking at the art and they were going, okay, you love this art, the Academy art, we don't, we're not going to pay for it. We're going to pay for this art, the art by these bohemian wildcats. This is what we think is exciting and what we think is interesting. And so collectors started shelling out large money for what then became Impressionist art and doing big showings over here where I am now in New York. And that, then the school became legitimized and powerful and was given a status by hard cash, which it hadn't been before. And so then 10 years later, they started doing an Impressionist exhibition. And then soon after that, the Salon, the official Salon, sort of withered on the vine, because it became clear that no one was really excited by the sort of pictures they were still defending.
Even if there isn't a direct line from the Salon des Refusés in 1863 to Impressionism 10 years later, some of the characters are the same, but a lot has to happen in between. But one of the things that 1863 did create a template for was the show that is the counter show to the main show could be where all the buzz is. And Impressionism definitely, that first Impressionist exhibition was definitely feeding off. It was inspired by the possibility of 1863, which is the people who have been refused can be the people around whom there is the most noise.
Absolutely right. And the noise tells its own story, and the noise creates its own momentum. And also you have to listen to the noise. You can't just bat it away. And, it might not be to your taste. It might not be according to your politics. It might not be whatever. But if you don't listen to it and you don't incorporate it into your sense of what's out there, you often see that sort of history moves quite quickly ahead of you and leaves you behind.
Part 2 of this mini-series with Dominic Dromgoole will be on Tuesday, so not in our regular slot. It's 3 episodes this week. And we're talking about another revolutionary event, an explosive first night in Parisian artistic, cultural history. It happened in 1896. It's the opening of a play called Ubu Roi, a childish, scatological, absurd, ridiculous play. But people in the audience, including the poet W.B. Yeats, thought, after they'd seen it, that the world would never be the same again. Do join us for that. This has been Past, Present, Future, part of the Airwave Podcast Network.